I would like to see advocates of children's rights band together. And I don't even see why they decided to call it male genital cutting and female genital cutting, honestly. But since they did, we need to band together across the sex and gender divide and make clear that the central ethical issue here is children having control over their own bodies. Look, if they decide when they're 18 they want to have something done, they can do that. I think it's a mistake, but they can do it. But even if it's just a little nick, there's an old saying that surgery on someone else is minor surgery. Surgery on yourself is never minor surgery. You have the right to say that this little nick should not be done to you, whether you're male or female. Psychological harm can ensue, so it's really important to protect the most voiceless among us.
Ladies, Stephen Svoboda.
Thank you, Mike.
You can't get stuff.
So I'm going to talk about genital autonomy, which will be terminology some of you will know and some of you won't. We wanted to flip the dialogue from talking about circumcision, and I'll use the word circumcision with new audiences, but I wanted to be for something rather than just against something. And I mean, I didn't invent the terminology, but it's been really a good thing being in favor of something rather than against something. And although I am proud that I had the first paper that used it in print. And I want to say that I feel like Alison Timon set the stage here, and I'm feeling that this conference is about love, and I'm so happy about that. And again, we're not against anything, we're for things. We're for children being whole and making decisions when they become adults. My beautiful wife is here taking photographs. So genital autonomy is an issue that cannot be covered in an hour or two, if it ever could be. I'm not going to get into the HIV issue, religion, so-called harm, medical claims, except in passing. I'm going to tell a couple stories that hopefully are interconnected about events that happened in 2001 and 2002, and then recent events that sort of followed up on it. And if I do my job well, it'll all connect up in a wonderful, amazing way. Hopefully that'll happen. So male children in the U.S., as many of us here know, routinely have about a third of their penile skin system removed, including the parts of the penis most sensitive to light touch, replacing a sheath of elastic skin with scar tissue that is often discolored. This is what is called a circumcision. Dr. Warren Farrell has written in it's been quite a number of years now since he wrote this, but I still consider it the most powerful, succinct summary tying together genital autonomy and broader men's issues. And of course, I'm involved through NCFM with the broader issues as well.
Hey you! Yes, you! Watching this video. Did you miss out on going to the International Conference on Men's Issues? Or did you go and now you missed the fun times you had at this amazing event? Experience the magic of ICMI 2019 again, or for the very first time, with Honey Badger Radio's ICMI disc set. The disc set brings ICMI presentations together in one convenient package, as well as disc set exclusive Badger bonus content. Enjoy behind-the-scenes Badger interviews with free speech and men's issues luminaries, like Sargon, Janice Fiamengo, and Count Dankula, as well as a never-before-seen Badger cartoon. Also available is sparkling ICMI merch, such as our professionally designed program book, sticker sets, badges, and more. Go to feedthebadger.com and claim a piece of men's rights history for yourself.
America's reflexive continuation of circumcision without research reflects the continuation of our tradition to desensitize boys to feelings of pain, to prepare them not to question the disposability of their bodies any more than they would question the disposability of their foreskins. So Queens, New York City, the most racially diverse square mile on the planet, at least it was back in those days. I was a lawyer in a male genital cutting case brought in Queens, and I'm going to use the terminology along the lines of the genital autonomy terminology I talked about. I'm going to say MGC, male genital cutting, for male cutting, and FGC, female genital cutting, for the female form. And if it comes up intersex genital cutting, which we also have worked on, by the way, for intersex folks who are born neither clearly male nor clearly female, as does happen. So in 2002, I was a lawyer in this case in Queens. We raised federal issues for the first time based on the 14th Amendment lack of due process, because the 14th Amendment has been used for parental cases in the past, and this hospital was systematically going to Spanish-speaking moms, presenting them with consent forms, because it's not the consent of the patient, right? It's the consent of the parent. Anyway, consent forms that, first of all, they showed them page 2, which said nothing. It just had the signature line. Page 1 had all the information. Secondly, they were Spanish speakers. It was in English. They did not translate it. This was not an accident. This was happening across the board. So this was the claim that we brought against the hospital, and I was the only Spanish speaker among our lawyers, so I was the one interviewing all 14 of what became the co-plaintiffs in the potential class action. And it was a lot of detailed work, and it could be monotonous, but also very exciting, very interesting, and of course I felt a lot of sympathy for all those mothers and of course the kids as well, and the fathers. So there was a visiting judge from Michigan, and keep that in mind because it's going to loop back later, Bernard Friedman, who used his full power to orchestrate a favorable result in this case for the defendants. And as you might guess from his name, he's probably Jewish, and that may or may not have affected his views. We don't know. What we do know is that he did a whole bunch of really impermissible things. I mean, this was 18 years ago, but I remember it like 17 years ago, but I remember it like yesterday. He yawned and rolled his eyes and looked down when we were talking. When the other side was talking, he nodded enthusiastically. Are you seeing this, jurors? Are you watching, jurors? This is the judge agreeing with the side you're supposed to agree with. He also gave us, the jurors, a form where he set it up so they had one single quick question to answer if the defendants won. And if they were going to say they lost, they had to go through this whole rubric of like 8 yes questions. And he said something about, well, it was like 5 o'clock p.m. when he presented to the jurors, and he sort of made this joke about, well, you know, if you vote in favor of the defense, it might take you 5 minutes. If you vote in favor of the plaintiffs, it might take you 3 hours. So we didn't really get our day in court, and literally we didn't get our day in court either. So that was that. And it was quite a while ago, but as you can imagine, I went to law school with faith in the system, belief in justice, belief that the world was a fair place. I wanted to make it a better place. That was why I went to law school. That's still why I'm a lawyer, more than a quarter century later. And I was not prepared for encountering the fact that courts basically would not even allow you to have a fair shake and to have your issue considered. And of course, at this point, many of us have seen this over and over and over in men's rights. So last November 2018, a federal judge in Detroit was addressing the case of 2 Michigan doctors and 6 others who were being prosecuted for violating the law against federal female genital cutting, FGC. Now, this law went into effect in 1997, but there was only one case brought under it until these recent events in Michigan. And the judge dismissed the case, ruling that this law, actually it's a 96 law, but it came into effect in 97, was unconstitutional. The basis for the judge finding the law unconstitutional was that it regulated local criminal activity. So the Commerce Clause, which is one clause in the Constitution which has been used to justify the federal government basically doing everything, the judge said, well, in this particular case, we're not going to allow that. And we won't go into that a lot at this point, but I think he's probably right. I mean, the Commerce Clause just gets way overused. But in any event, the name seemed familiar to me. I was like, Bernard Friedman, where have I heard that before? Was he one of those famous judges that we used to read their decisions in law school? No, that's not it. Then I finally realized it was the same Bernard Friedman we had. Can you hear me? It was actually the same Bernard Friedman we'd had 16 years earlier. So there's certainly differences between the cases. I mean, in one case, there was no day in court. In the other case, there was. But then the judge said, we're not going to allow this law to stand because of the fact that it's not justified by the Constitution. But still the same outcome, that in both cases the judge found a way not to protect children from genital cutting. And of course, we'd like to see uniformity but in the opposite direction, where children are protected and are allowed to decide when they become adults. And the judge also said, interestingly, that the reason that we didn't need the law was unconstitutional, is female genital cutting is already against the law in every state, which he's right about that. And guess what? male genital cutting is already against the law in all 50 states too. But of course the problem is that it's very common here, and we're like fish swimming in the ocean. We don't see the water, and often the judges are circumcised, and so it's a public education campaign. So it sort of comes back to all of us in this room. So a Dutch medical colleague of mine had an interesting comment. We in Europe keep surgery as a last resort for treating or preventing disease, especially when those benefits are possible without surgery, and even more so when the patient cannot consent. But in America, you doctors begin with surgery, one of the first experiences of life for a healthy boy, certainly the first sexual experience, and ask what treatable infections that he could have avoided anyway will he hopefully get somewhat less of. This is completely contrary to medical ethics, makes no sense. And even the American Academy of Pediatrics has basically admitted that there is only one very small possible theoretical justification for circumcision, but it's way outweighed by the risks, and even that one is not definite, so there's no justification, folks, and this has just been going on due to cultural inertia. So there's been this dilemma where we've got all forms of male genital cutting allowed, but this law that outlaws even extremely minor forms of female genital cutting that actually are more minor than circumcision, and how do you make those consistent with the requirement not to discriminate based on gender? Well, you of course can't. Again, this is something that needs to be, people's awareness needs to be raised about it. So some people have taken the approach of actually trying to make certain minor forms of female genital cutting legal, which is not a direction that any of us in the movement really support, to sort of create a buffer of protection to circumcise male children by also doing it to female children. Well, I see a different way out of this mess. I would like to see advocates of children's rights band together, and I don't even see why they decided to call it male genital cutting and female genital cutting, honestly, but since they did, we need to band together across the sex and gender divide and make clear that the central ethical issue here is children having control over their own bodies. Look, if they decide when they're 18 they want to have something done, they can do that. I think it's a mistake, but they can do it. But even if it's just a little nick, there's an old saying that surgery on someone else is minor surgery. Surgery on yourself is never minor surgery. You have the right to say that this little nick should not be done to you, whether you're male or female. Psychological harm can ensue, so it's really important to protect the most voiceless among us. So interestingly, before I get to the second sort of main issue I want to talk about, or set of developments I want to talk about, there have been several legal cases supporting genital autonomy, but not in the US. In Europe, there have been two German courts, one very famous case in 2012 that later was legislatively overruled, basically based on Jewish lobbies, and some Islamic lobbies, but almost entirely Jewish lobbies arguing that it was anti-Semitic, discriminatory, whatever. So I try not to get into those issues. I'm not myself Jewish, and I feel like, nor am I Islamic, and I feel like those communities need to take up those discussions themselves. But there have been a total of 5 legal cases, 2 in Germany, 1 in France, and 2 in the UK. And one in the UK was really interesting because the judge said it was what's called dicta. It wasn't actually the ruling, but the judge did say that some forms of male genital cutting are worse than some forms of female genital cutting. So that was a very interesting thing to be said in a UK court. And then a later decision protected 2 boys from male genital cutting. So you might wonder why these cases were decided in Europe and not the US. I think there's a bunch of reasons, but I think the main one is there aren't as many circumcised men in Europe, so the judges aren't circumcised, and the culture isn't circumcised in its brain, thinking that this is somehow an okay thing to do. There's other reasons, but I won't get sidetracked here. So the second piece is in 2001 we went to the UN, like Mike said in my introduction, went to Geneva, and I presented written and oral, they're called interventions, written and oral interventions to the UN that became the first record in the UN, and I believe it's actually still the only document at the UN that is centrally related to male circumcision. There are other documents that do talk about male circumcision as a human rights violation, so that's really good news. So we also met with all the sub-commissioners, at the UN in the Subcommission for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, which is now the Human Rights Commission. It had a name change. But very interesting because the first few commissioners that we went to, very friendly, very open. You know, we talked to them about our views, maybe a half hour, presented them with a bunch of documents. It was DVDs in those days and books, and they seemed very receptive. Now, I wasn't naive enough to think that they were going to go back to their offices and immediately get on their computers and write complaints. You know, that wasn't going to happen. I knew that. But what actually was happening was a little bit disappointing because as time went on, after our first 4 or 5 meetings, nobody showed up for these meetings. So they were clearly talking to themselves, telling them what our issue was, and not coming and not even telling us. And this happened like 7 or 8 times, and we'd call them and leave voicemail messages. Hey, you know, did you forget about the time? Do you want to reschedule? And we never hear back. So that violated my sense of what's right. Another thing that violated my sense of what's right came up from some research I was doing, and you have to imagine this now. We're in a different age now. This is 2001, and so the way you did research on human rights in 2001 was you went down in this dark basement of the UN in Geneva, and you went through paper. It wasn't organized electronically in any way, and you made photocopies. I had a stack of photocopies about this high in my hotel room, right next to my picture of my son, who's now 17, the first ultrasound that I just grabbed and took with me to Geneva. It just came out right before I went over there. And what came out of that stack of paper was a very surprising thing. So the UN had a commission called the Subcommission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children. Now, one might query, well, what happened to males in that? Leaving that aside, women and children. One day, it became women and girl children. No explanation, no proclamation, no, hey, we're changing the title because of these reasons. Girls have historically faced issues boys haven't faced. Nothing, no explanation whatsoever. And I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I thought I must have made a mistake, and nobody had ever talked about it. Apparently, I was the first person to find it out. This was several years after it had happened. And I went over and over, and sure enough, so when we did present our intervention to the UN, we just asked for 2 things. One was that they reverse the change in the mandate to be what it was. We didn't even ask for males to be put in there, for adult males to be in there. We just asked for females and children, and this was a strategic decision. We were trying to ask for winnable things. And the other was we requested a study by the Subcommission of Circumcision as a human rights violation, which, by the way, has happened since then in the last few years, so that's good news. Oh, and Mrs. Warzazi, right. Oh, my goodness. So the Special Rapporteur on Traditional Practices Affecting Women and the Girl Child, as it was now called, was then this Moroccan woman named Halima Mbarak Warzazi, who is Moroccan and was Islamic, as we quickly learned, because our team went in and talked to her, and she was quite rude, but we persisted, and eventually, I cannot address your issue. I'm barred from addressing your issue because I'm Muslim. Imagine going to court and you have a judge, and the judge says, I can't decide your case because I'm Muslim or whatever. I'm male. I'm from Chicago, and this is a case about Detroit, and I don't like Detroit. I mean, again, I was stunned. I mean, it seemed like the possibilities for me to be stunned were unlimited, and that was it. I mean, it wasn't like she had a supervisor we could contact. I mean, we pretty much had nowhere to go from there, but that was another disappointing experience. I thought in my naivete, although I knew the UN was very feminist leaning, but in my naivete, I thought, well, there must still be a possibility to get through to somebody. We also went to WHO, by the way. I went to WHO while I was there, and it was even worse than the UN. Like, barely could even get in the door. I mean, it's just crazy. Okay, so now fast forward to last year. So there's a small international group of us, 8 of us in almost as many countries, so we're meeting usually midnight for one of us and 6 a.m. for another one of us on Skype, and we put together an NGO and created a report about the issue of circumcision as a human rights violation. We went into quite a lot of detail about the reasons for that, and it's available online. I should have probably included that as one of my links. I can add it. But in any event, so we made some good connections with some of the people in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which again is the same group that we were working with before in the UN. It's the same group. It changed names, but the same group. So we made some good connections, and we actually got invited, after we submitted our general report, we actually got invited to submit what's basically a friend of the court brief. I don't know if everyone here knows what that is, an amicus brief, but a brief where you're not a party to the case, so you're not the defendant, you're not the plaintiff, but as a favor to the court, you're submitting your views on the issue. Let's say it's a case of racism. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, might submit an amicus brief. So we were basically being asked by the UN to submit an amicus brief on this Finnish circumcision case. And so we got the documents translated from Finnish to English, and it was quite hard getting the documents from the former attorney. I don't know what the reason for that was. I don't think she opposed us. I think she just was very disorganized. But in any event, we got the invitation. We put it together. It was due on New Year's Eve last year. And so I just, looking back on it, it's funny. At about 2 p.m. on New Year's Eve, which of course was 1 hour before the deadline, I was frantically finalizing all the details, and we got the thing off, and it just felt so amazing to get this request to do this and to put it together, 8 of us. The former leader sadly passed away. Paul Mason did a fantastic job, Australian lawyer, which was what led to me taking over last year. So let me talk a little bit about what we went through, because I think it'll be relevant. We first had a short introduction setting forth a brief history of unequal treatment of males and females and the UN's human rights that are violated, talked about religion, citing these cases, these European cases I've been talking about, scope of the problem, 650 million males living today with genital cutting, 100 million females, foreskin anatomy and complications, ethics. So there's 4 core ethical principles. Apparently, male circumcision violates all 4 of them: autonomy, non-malevolence, meaning do no harm, benevolence, and justice. And so we concluded by recommending that, or by stating that one violation not justify another violation, and asked that the court make a guilty finding against the Finnish defendants who committed the circumcision. The answer hasn't been handed down yet. It's not due till October. But I'm just so happy to be standing here before you and talking about this. And it does feel, and not just on this issue, but I feel like in general, things are changing. We're making a lot of progress. And thank you to everyone in this room from the bottom of my heart. It's just great to be standing here. And we're not done, obviously. And still, if you go out in the street and talk to 10 people, 9 of them aren't going to know what men's rights are, let alone be in favor of us, but even know what they are. So we still have a ways to go, but I'm just so heartened by the progress and so thankful to everyone. So, and we have some forces in our favor. The proliferation of the internet, which is just keeps going more crazy every year. Growing skepticism to authority also cuts in our favor, if you excuse the expression. Doctors aren't given the respect that the automatic respect that used to be given, which, I think is a good thing. I think they deserve respect, but they don't deserve automatic, unreasoning respect without looking at what they're suggesting. And I believe that changes in perceptions of gender and sex may also be helping in this world. There are some people very close to me who have recently decided that they're male rather than female, and I feel like the world is freeing up. I feel like our concepts are freeing up. Our reified, if you know what that word means, very fixed ideas of what male and female are freeing up. And I feel like that actually is going to favor us, because feminism depends on this concept of men are this and women are this. But if men can be loving, if men can be open-hearted, if men can be beautiful beings, as we all can be, and as women can be just as much, obviously, it just blows the whole thing out of the water. So I feel very optimistic about that. And I feel as long as childhood genital cutting is perceived as a gender issue, we will remain divided. Once it becomes a human issue, we will stand united. The personal is political for us, too. Thank you. I'll stand out here.
Oh, he's too tall, look.
And you've got my audio, which is great. That I forgot to. Oh, that's sure. Oh, no, you can just stick that in your pocket. Okay.
Apologies, this isn't exactly about your topic, but
that's fine.
When you were talking about, you had the documents translated from you said Finnish.
Right.
How do you cite those documents if you don't even know the language? Like if you're highlighting a section or and speaking to it or something like that.
Well, I mean, Google Translate can translate it enough that you can tell what it is. I left this out of my talk, but there's a funny little thing I'm going to add now because I've been planning to write this set of articles about the European developments in the law about male circumcision, which is a strange thing since I'm obviously not a European lawyer, but no one else is doing it. So I figured. And I found all these cases that no one seemed to know about, and one of them was from Finland. So back about 3-4 years ago, I found a Finnish translator and got the lowercase translated. And then when this request for us to do this friend of the court brief came across, and I went and had the Finnish Supreme Court translated, it turned out it was the same case, and I was just like, wow, it's a small world. Anyway, thanks for bearing with that story. Did that answer your question?
I actually have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, I'll just go with a comment.
Yep.
Because you said that you couldn't comment on Jewish circumcision because you're not Jewish. I'm Jewish, so I'm going to do that for you.
Okay.
And we should go on tour. You said, well, I can't talk about it, but my friend here can.
We had a Jewish person on our team in the UN, right, and we brought that up to Mrs. Warzazi when she said that thing about, oh, I'm Islamic, so I can't do my job, you know.
Yeah. To me, it fits the definition of child abuse, and religion is no justification for child abuse. We don't allow someone to cite some biblical command, spare the rod and spoil the child, as a justification for whipping your child with a rod.
Right.
And so I feel comfortable being a proud, active Jew, totally opposed to circumcision. And in Israel, actually, I read that the rate of circumcision is declining as they've invented alternative
That's a funny
rituals.
thing, yeah.
So,
go ahead.
Just to finish, I'm when I was a kid, Judaism is constantly changing and reforming, and it's not just that we don't sacrifice animals and stone adulterers anymore. It's in flux. And when I was a kid, the concept of a female rabbi was just so foreign to me. You know, it never occurred to me. It never occurred to me to think, how come dolphins aren't allowed to compete in swimming in the Olympics?
Exactly.
It just never occurred to me. And now half the rabbis in my area are women.
Yeah.
And I'm absolutely convinced that if we circumcised girls instead of boys, Jewish feminists would have ended the practice a long time ago.
Right. And I will say a little more, actually, because although I'm not Jewish, my kids consider themselves Jewish because their mom is Jewish, and in any event, and it's so not an issue. I mean, you know, both of them was left intact. One was born female, one was born male. You won't be surprised probably that either of them was, but left intact. But it's just crazy. I mean, this idea that, he's going to see his dad in the bathtub, or, he's going to go to temple and they're going to find out he's not circumcised. And, I mean, even rabbis, for a while there was a search for a synagogue, and even the rabbis that spoke would sometimes come out and say, we don't care about the circumcision issue. It's just such a that may be different in different parts of the world, I understand, but I completely agree, Fred. It's really changing and freeing up a lot.
So the ideological composition of intactivists completely changes based on which social media platform you're on. And one of the debates that raged on intactivist Twitter for, I should say a few years ago, but it's been going on for a couple of years, the difference between belief in a human right to bodily autonomy versus a belief in the human right to bodily integrity.
Right.
The difference being that if you believe in bodily autonomy, you say, my body, my choice, and the choice is the principle of your entire argument, whereas if you believe in genital integrity, you're saying, you can't cut the genitals of a child without a medical justification, and those have basically come into conflict in a couple different issues that aren't related to circumcision. And I don't want to, mention all of them, but I'll give one example, which is the fear that if you promote my body, my choice, that eventually down the line you'll get to, my body, my choice, I have the right to commit suicide, as an example. If you take bodily autonomy to its logical extreme. How would you balance the tension between those two concepts, and how would you prevent bodily autonomy from going off the cliff of promoting suicide and euthanasia in our country or in the West in general?
Oh, well, the last thing comes up a lot where people say, oh, you're being inconsistent between abortion and circumcision, or you're being inconsistent between. I've heard a lot of ones that seem wacky to me. Honestly, like I don't get that engaged in those discussions. I feel like I have a certain issue that I work on, and it's really a rat hole to go down these other issues, and so I try to avoid that. But I'm glad you asked me that question, because I actually don't. I mean, I actually don't think it makes sense that it's illegal, for example, to cut your arm off. There was a case in the UK, I think, right, Mike, where wasn't there a case where there were these gay men, and one of them was really into doing weird things to another gay man, and they were like cutting off body parts and stuff, and that's actually not legal, and I don't see why circumcision should be. All right.
Which is not how that's my Friday evening, we've got to say, but both of them were found guilty.
They were found guilty, right? So that's not actually amputating, but it is illegal to cut off an arm, cut off a leg, even if you want to do it for some reason. So I actually don't see why that should be illegal and circumcision should be legal even for adults. But that's just my personal view, and that's so far down the road. And I never say that to a group other than this group, because it could be counterproductive. Because really the goal is to get us to a point where children are being left alone to decide for themselves. But yeah, it's a good question.
I think you said near the beginning of the speech that circumcision is already illegal in all 50 states.
Right.
Right? And obviously that's not being enforced.
Right. To say the least.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know, like, what's the basis for saying that it's already illegal? Is that based off of like?
Well, Judge Friedman said that female genital cutting was already illegal in the 50 states, and that's why the female genital cutting law was unconstitutional. And all the laws that he was mentioning for female cutting are just as applicable to male. Assault, battery, in some states there's sexual assault laws. There's probably other ones, probably false imprisonment might apply. There's probably a whole bunch of them, but certainly assault and battery is an easy one in all states. It's just like there's other things like not allowing everyone to vote, and a black man wasn't actually 3/5 of a person exactly, but in a sense they were treated that way. All sorts of things we've done in the past that made no sense, but that still happened because the public understanding tolerated it. So I think really it's about educating the public, educating the judiciary, and we're making progress. We really are. There's definitely more to do, but you're doing it partly, Stephen. I mean, Mike Buchanan's doing it. I mean, my wife's doing it. She talks about it. I mean, we really are.
I have another question. I heard in New York after this whole Epstein thing happened that they removed the statute of limitations for child sex abuse. I was just
right. It's pretty much the same answer.
Possible to use something like that to start prosecuting like circumcision.
It's pretty much the same answer. It should be possible. It's pretty much the same answer as to why male circumcision isn't considered illegal. It should be usable, but it isn't, just because courts will not see it as that. And it's been tried. I mean, and it's been, as you can imagine, although I'm not a litigator myself, I did have those two cases that I talked about, one of them. But I hated litigation. I hated the experience. I'm not going to do it again. I can support litigation, but I don't actually do it myself. But having done those two cases, I've seen how these things play out, and how the law just twists things and doesn't give you a fair result. It's unfortunate, but we're just not in a place right now to understand that law should apply. But you're absolutely right. It should apply. Okay. And would apply in a fair, just world, the world we're all working for.
Thanks.
Since you're a lawyer, how would you, as a lawyer, how would you distinguish between a legitimate medical procedure on an infant versus something like circumcision?
Well, it's pretty easy in the case of circumcision because, like I say, there's been a lot of scrutiny of these different claims for circumcision, HIV. I really roll my eyes at that one, and even the American Academy of Pediatrics, which has pretty much been an apologist for circumcision for like the last 3+ decades, even they have admitted that there's actually no basis for it. They still go ahead and say, oh, but we want to allow the parents to have input, and so their positions don't make sense if you analyze them critically. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the main pediatric association in the U.S., but there's not even, the thing about circumcision is there's not even one actual medical benefit to it, and there's definite harm, for sure. There's immunological effects, there's erogenous effects, there's protective effects. All three of those are harms, and a lot of men feel, for a lot of men, they feel like it's the core wound of their whole lives. It ruins their whole lives. I know men whose lives are ruined. I know men who committed suicide because of it. In fact, I have close colleagues I've worked with who have committed suicide, including one this year. I mean, it happens routinely. It's pretty common. And even if they don't commit suicide, they're depressed, their lives are ruined. I'm lucky that I'm one of the least affected men who was circumcised, who's a core activist. I feel very fortunate about that, but it really does ruin lives for a lot of men.
Yeah, one other question, too, to kind of follow up on what you said. I've also heard that people claim that it enhances the pleasure during sex. Is that true, or is that not true?
No.
Okay.
I've heard that said.
I've just heard it said. So.
Well, I had a friend who was circumcised as an adult, and he claimed that it enhanced his pleasure. I think so.
I've got a counter-example. I've been circumcised as an adult, and I say no, it doesn't enhance anything. It actually makes it worse. The doctor itself says, yes, you can last longer. That was his argument, and he said that will be an advantage for you. Mm-hmm. But I found out that now I last so long that I don't come anymore. That's no fun at all. It is no fun at all to have sex, and it doesn't happen at the end, because you just haven't got enough stimulus anymore. Nice. So what the doctors say as an advantage, and I heard also what Muslims say as an advantage, that can actually turn into a massive disadvantage. So I say no.
Okay.
And the risk is there, and don't take that risk, basically.
The fact there are individual men who will claim that circumcision helped their sex lives, but we could probably find men who would claim that eating Lucky Charms makes their sex life 3 times better. I mean, you have to go back to the 4 core ethical values that are observed in all other medical cases, other than this odd exception that has been grandfathered in since the 19th century, 150 years ago, when this character Louis Sayre brought it in, and we've had it ever since. And you've got to look at it rationally, as Europe is doing, which is why these cases are coming down in Europe. Religion, people have the right to practice religion. I'm a fan of organized religion myself. I'm not an opponent of organized religion. I'm also not an opponent of doctors, unlike a lot of people in the movement. I'm just not. I'm not going to make anybody wrong to win this, except people that support circumcision. Those are the only people.
All right. One other question it's a two-parter. Is the argument when you were litigating, was it on a religious basis or on a medical cleanly basis or something like that?
You mean
the reason for, if somebody's going to say we should be circumcising for this reason?
Well, there were 2 cases I was involved in. There was the class action that I talked about in Queens, and then there was the case of this Greek boy who was circumcised sort of just by accident, and his father felt like it was the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and he apparently felt that way too, because the Greek culture doesn't do it at all, and they take baths in the nude, and it was very noticeable and sort of odd, and I think the kid reacted more because the father was so upset about it. But nevertheless, the father's reaction was reasonable, and the kid's reaction was reasonable. So in both those cases, I'm trying to think now, you bring the lawsuit, and it doesn't really come up, actually, because the defendants aren't defending circumcision as an overall practice. They're just explaining why they aren't at fault on any of the causes of action. And none of our causes of action is, circumcision should be illegal, or you can't argue that. I mean, you would just lose immediately if you try to make that the basis of your case. So unfortunately, when you're a lawyer bringing these cases, you're forced to bring them based on, malpractice and lack of consent in quotation marks.
Because you mentioned the inertia thing, and it seems like the public perception is that it's simply cleaner, which I find to be ridiculous. I mean, how is it that farm animals aren't circumcised and are fine, but the cleanest
it's illegal to circumcise a dog?
The cleanest animal ever by a million is has issues. I can't logically connect those.
Oh, totally. There's no logic to it. That's one out of. But it does come from our Puritan. Back in the days when Puritans had a fairly important profile in the U.S. and were, I don't know, they were actually a majority technically, but they were certainly a majority in their influence. This Puritan, ultra clean, ultra squeaky clean, and the upper class did it and the lower class didn't. And this was the thing you did to be a good person. And the whole thing's weird and twisted, but this is where we are today. I can't believe it's still happening in 2019. As Norm Cohen said in the 90s, in a movie made in the 90s when we still had videotape, we've been to the moon. We're still doing this? Unbelievable. We are reducing the rates, which is great. I'd like to see it reduce faster. But yeah, Marilyn Milos quit nursing, and she thought, well, I'll stop circumcision in 6 months, and then I'll go back to work as a nurse. Well, she's still running Genital Autonomy America, formerly No Circ.
I got to ask my question now. I'm wondering in terms of what forces will bring down the rate of circumcision in the United States. I'm wondering what economics would play in that. We're looking for ways to reduce our medical expenses. This is needless. Can we sue? Can I sue Kaiser? Because my premiums are higher than they would be if they didn't cover circumcision.
We're working on that. I mean, as you can imagine, all angles have been thought of at one point or other by one person or other. It's slippery because of our crazy health system where there's so many different fiefdoms, and some systems include circumcision as part of the overall cost, others don't. I don't think there has been a different male baby price being born versus female baby price. I don't think that exists. But people are working on that. And the elusive thing, the problem is that the complications get hidden, the problems get hidden, they don't get tracked. People don't go back and say, oh, well, you died of infection at 2 weeks old. Well, what could the infection have been caused by? And in some cases, it's glaringly obvious. It gets covered up. Sometimes the parents are grieving. They don't want to become activists, which is understandable, totally understandable. But so it's a combination of so many factors. It's not one thing.
So
could someone take a picture of my wife asking a question and send it to me, please? Be nice to have.
She took plenty of pictures.
No, you should put it down here. Wow. So in my line of work with adults, I find that any type of trauma that happened to that adult from the time they were in their mom's in utero to about 7 years old will absolutely affect the unconscious way that they deal with the world as an adult, whether it's through mindset or emotional state, etc. And I mean, I have not been circumcised in any way or had any genital cutting, but I can imagine it's absolutely a traumatic thing for an infant to have, that very sensitive part of their body removed without any pain, medication on. I happened to see the tray thing that the infants are put on, this
circumstraint,
hard plastic. It looks like a torture device from a horror movie or something. And so not only does the infant not have anything soft, at least, it's also hard. So the entire experience has to just be, from my understanding of the human condition, incredibly traumatic. And so I'm curious, has there been any research or studies done? Because the other thing, too, that happens, I had trauma as an infant, and one's body does this, right? You crouch when you're, and the restraints are being held. So they're stimulating all those muscles, but they can't cover their bodies because they're restrained. So all that energy and pain and terror, whatever, is being stored in the arms and legs. And I know from my own personal experience as an infant that there's parts of my body that still have to kind of release from that trauma. So I'm wondering, has there ever been any studies that have looked at stored stress in the muscle or emotional or anger issues or something like that because of in populations of circumcised boys versus not? Thanks.
There have been some studies in that direction. There was a set of a few studies from the 90s from Sweden, I think it was. There's a lot of areas of this issue that unfortunately are understudied, but the thing is people don't want the message. That's the bottom line problem. David Chamberlain wrote a book, too, about the same issue, about it causing problems, circumcision causing problems through birth trauma. But the message needs to be, the public needs to be primed so the message can be received.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Svoboda.